Sorry about that. That was good. Good spot.
No, having too much fun. That's okay. Yeah, so today it's all about vulnerable road user safety, which is very much my passion and my expertise subject. Things that we'll be going through are things like, well, what are the vulnerable road users? And that's basically anyone that's not in a vehicle, a passenger vehicle. So it's pedestrians, cyclists, and motorcyclists. And although motorcyclists do have, perhaps a little bit more safety features, they're usually wearing leathers and have the helmet that covers the full face, generally speaking, we just lump them into this vulnerable road user category. Just a recap from previous modules, the way that we calculate risk within the Safe System framework is our exposure, which we've mentioned is all to do with the numbers. So it should always be a figure as your answer there. So it could be AADT, or the number of cyclists, the number of pedestrians, the number of motorcyclists. That's what exposure is. So it's the easiest of them to calculate when you actually get into the scoring system, but it's the one that people tend to mix up the most with likelihood, because they are related, but we separate them in this framework. The likelihood is generally much more understood, as that's very much what road safety practitioners have been doing for decades now, understanding the risks associated with different road environments and how they influence crash types. So that's all to do with our likelihood. And our severity is basically assuming that, okay, this crash has occurred. What measures are in place to reduce the severity of it? And that's where we get things like our speed. We can reduce the speed. That's definitely going to reduce the severity. And also the geometry, which Rosie touched on before, where if it's like a T intersection like that, that is not a favorable crash angle, where it's straight into a passenger side or a driver side door. If we're able to make that a more acute angle and get crashes that kind of glance off each other, that would reduce the severity. We've got a few slides here just to run through those different categories. So on the left-hand side, we just got those categories in place. The first one that we're mentioning here is our exposure to crashes. And in this example here, what we actually have is a road closure. It's a little bit difficult to see, but there's a mound of dirt or earth that has just been placed in the middle of the road, which is obviously stopping any through traffic through that location. Further along there, there's an intersection. So it's removing the exposure at that intersection because there's no longer any traffic at that intersection. It's only, one way now. Another example of this type of exposure would be creating a cul-de-sac. So actually terminating a leg before it gets to an intersection, therefore removing that exposure. Another good example of exposure in the real world or in practice is providing grade separation. So in this example, we have a motor highway and an elevated structure. So that's where all your trucks and buses and general traffic are situated. And there's no pedestrian or cyclist facilities. Instead, they have provided an alternative route, which is grade separated, so completely protected and away from general traffic. If you can ever do this, this is obviously the best outcome because you've completely eliminated the risk of those two modes colliding with each other. So you're not worried about likelihood and you're not worried about severity because the exposure is zero. So that's generally your best outcome. Admittedly, it's challenging to meet those requirements in lots of the projects that we work within, but it's still worth noting that, this type of arrangement really exemplifies those safe system principles. While we're on exposure, This is just the definition provided within the Austroads guide. So exposure refers to which road users in what numbers are using the road and thus exposed to a potential crash. I don't know why they make these things so long worded, but measures of exposure include AADT, side road traffic volumes, number of motorcyclists, cyclists, pedestrians crossing or walking along the road. In layman's terms, it's just the units of whichever mode you're looking at, there are within a day or within an hour or whatever measure that you're using. So all you're focused on with exposure is volumes, so traffic volumes. Okay? Because the Safe System Assessment Framework is relatively new, like it's still being embedded in our various jurisdictions, you will find through application that there are some little intricacies or just some pain points, I suppose you could say, ways that the framework could be interpreted in a few different ways. And so what we've done is we've created these Safe System Assessment fact sheets. And it's basically because we're regularly involved in completing SSAs, just things that we've noticed along the way and the way that we believe the guidelines should be interpreted, or the best practice of interpreting the guidelines. So they're very, very useful once you actually get involved in safe system assessments. Invariably, you'll come across some of these issues, and the guidelines don't necessarily prescribe how to approach that issue. These fact sheets would be a very useful resource for you. So we've provided a link within our learning management system to these fact sheets. So we recommend just downloading them and keeping them until you need them. Particularly with the last assignment that you do, where you will be doing a bit of a mock SSA, these fact sheets may come in handy there. So just to give you an example of the first one, it says how to assess projects with multiple distinct sections. So imagine you're in a rural environment on a highway and you've been asked to do an SSA from all the way from the town outskirts into the town center itself. So you've got, a rural environment, which could be 100 kilometers per hour, and also a town center, which has got obviously a very different layout and configuration. So how would you actually apply the safe system assessment guidelines within those two distinct sections or multiple distinct sections? So that's just one example. But yeah, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily spelled out within the framework. So that's why we thought we would provide these for practitioners. Okay. By the end of this module, what we want to focus on is we're actually going to tie the safe system thinking into movement and place. So for those that have heard about that framework before, if you're new, that's fine. We'll go through it all together today. We'll discuss the key characteristics for vulnerable road users, and particularly how to align well with safe system principles. And most importantly, what I'd like to get out of today is much better clarification and improved skills in classifying whether we're targeting exposure, likelihood, or severity. And because I'm going to keep saying those words over and over today, I'm just going to abbreviate it to E, L, and S. So E, exposure, L, likelihood, S, severity. So let's get stuck in. Movement and place. So for those that haven't heard of this, it's just an acknowledgement that roads actually serve two core functions. We tend to get focused solely on the first one, which was movement. So that's the movement of people. It's not just the movement of passenger vehicles. It could be the movement of cyclists or pedestrians or people on a bus. It's the movement of people. The other imperative function that our road networks provide is a place function. lots of, streets pass through areas that are very attractive, where people want to spend time. People, want to dine out on the footpaths, or they want to cross the road to get from different bars and restaurants and things like that. So it's got this place function as well. And on this scale here, so this one is actually taken from Transport for New South Wales. Different jurisdictions have slightly different words and slightly different graphs and matrices, but the philosophy is the same. What we're having here is, as you increase your movements, what that is saying is that movement function becomes more and more important strategically. Similarly, for a place function, as it goes higher up, the place function becomes more important. So perhaps the clearest one in this entire matrix is where you have no place function and it's all about the movement, is a motorway. Because you don't want people stopping and spending time there and dwelling. That's not the purpose of that road at all. It is solely to get traffic moving. So that one's probably the clearest little classification within this framework, but we'll also look at the other ones, which can get a little bit more open to interpretation and a little bit more challenging to work within. So first one we'll get stuck into is this idea of places for people. So this is an area where we acknowledge, this is the bottom right hand, where we acknowledge that, okay, the community really valued this place as somewhere that's important to them. Most likely it's going to be, CBD districts or high streets, areas where there's lots of pedestrian generators or, attractions and things like that. Could be adjacent a railway station, for instance. And within that same thinking, it serves a low movement function, or rather it's been strategically analyzed as it doesn't need to serve a massive movement function. Maybe that's a better way to phrase it. So in this space here, we've got lots of place value, not a lot of movement value. And here's an example of what this could look like in the real world, where this is actually a carriageway, but it's a shared area. So pedestrians actually have priority across there. The speed would be 10 kilometers per hour. And you can tell if you were driving through there, it doesn't feel like that is really a space for vehicles. It doesn't feel like you have, the priority within there, which is exactly what you want to communicate. And that's kind of achieved by the use of, planter boxes and streetscaping and narrowing the environments and things like that. So there's a whole range of treatments, which we will get into. The next slide I've got here is, let's just call this a hypothetical, where this is what currently a road network looks like. It's 40 kilometers per hour. You can see I've got traffic in both directions. I've got pedestrians using the footpath, but also wanting to cross over. I've got cyclists. I should mention, sorry, that this is right-hand drive for those. It's flipped, obviously, but so this is just what we've said. This is an existing scenario. Maybe you can even picture a local street or a road that looks like that. And if we wanted to move this existing layer into something that more meets a places for people classification, what type of treatments do you think we could install to achieve that? So before you pop anything in the chat as well, what I'm after is if you could write in the chat a recommendation or an infrastructure treatment that would make this look more like a place for people, and in brackets, write down that would influence the exposure, the likelihood, or the severity. So you should have your treatment, and then in brackets, either an E, an L, or an S. And it could be multiple. It could be L and S, for example. But I'll spend, let's just say, 3 minutes on this little activity here and give you a go and see what ideas you come up with to make this a more people-friendly places for people. All right. I'm seeing lots and lots of wonderful suggestions, so feel free to keep typing them in as I just pick out a few. There's lots of different answers here. First one that caught my eye was very open and just saying reduce vehicle volume with an E. And we give out a prize to Greg there, Kez, because I completely agree with that. If we are reducing traffic volumes, we are influencing exposure. So that's bang on. It's 100%. The other interesting thing within that space is, let's just say that this was, so that was quite vague as to how you would reduce traffic volume, but I'm just going to take it a step further and say we're going to make this a one-way road instead of two-way. Surely that's going to half the volumes. And I don't know why the pen does that. Hopefully I can draw this out without it getting too upset at me. Let's say that this was like a block. And previously this used to be two-way, but I'm going to make it one-way. And if we were just analyzing this road or this site in particular, and we just looked at the exposure, it'd be probably fair to assume that we are going to reduce exposure. We're going to reduce the number of traffic traveling through there because we haven't got two traffic flows anymore. We've only got one direction. The little caveat I'll say there is it's very likely that you are just pushing the problem elsewhere. So maybe that means more vehicles are using the alternative route, which is adjacent. So maybe there's going to be an induced demand in the next block over, which maybe cannot cater for that extra traffic or doesn't have treatments to, support that extra traffic flow. Which gets into an interesting topic, because in a safe system assessment, when you define your scope and you're saying, I'm only focused on this street here, so this is what I'm worried about. I'm only worried about exposure, likelihood, severity for this street, because that's what I've been tasked with. Within a safe system assessment, it's probably fair to do that with the acknowledgement that you would have to do further investigation to see how that would impact other aspects of the network. Because there's a very real chance that this could have poor safety outcomes for the adjacent block. A way you could also capture that within the safe system assessment is to acknowledge that right at the get-go, and just acknowledge if this becomes one way, I should also do a safe system assessment on the next block as well. Because then you can compare, okay, well, this is what it was existing. If I make this one way, this will get slightly better, but this will get much, much worse. So maybe we don't go with that as an option. So you could also broaden your scope right at the get-go of an SSA and just, try and incorporate that as a risk. It does get into a little bit of a territory of, well, where do you stop? Because you could then look at the next intersection and the next block and, continuing to chase that. But all of those decisions need to be made right at the front of an SSA. Once you're getting the team together, defining the scope, there's not one set approach as to how to exactly define that. But it's a really good, just a nice little tip that we've, I suppose, learnt over the years delivering these SSAs. Okay, I'm seeing lots of speed reductions, and speed reduction I completely agree with. And in terms of categorizing it, I would put that in likelihood and severity. So speed reduction, L and S. The reason being, if you're driving slower, you're much more likely to be able to, stop and slow before there is a collision. And also, there's less braking distance required as well. So if you're traveling faster, it takes longer to stop. If you're traveling slower, more likely to be able to stop before a collision occurs. So that certainly affects likelihood. And with severity, remember, when we look at severity, we phrase it in the sense that a collision has occurred, what influences that crash outcome. And if you are reducing the speed, you're definitely going to get a reduced level of trauma, or anticipated level of trauma. So speed reductions, always L and S, likelihood and severity. Lots of suggestions to widen the footpath, which is spot on. Exposure, taking away the bus route. That's a very interesting suggestion. So I do agree, once again, that would fit in the exposure category because you're removing volume from that particular area. Separating cyclists, creating kind of like a shared zone where everyone just shares the area. Last one here from Kirsten, rough road surface to slow vehicles. That's another one that's really, really common in the UK. I used to live in Edinburgh in Scotland, and cobble streets were just the norm. So implementing kind of 30km/h wide networks within residential areas within Edinburgh it's kind of touted globally as a really phenomenal thing. But in practice, it's actually very uncomfortable to drive faster than 30 kilometers, unless you're in a four-wheel drive, because it's just, you feel it, and you don't really want to do that in a passenger vehicle. So I think that is a very sensible solution. But on the other side of that, if you do have cyclists within that area, you want to be providing them a smooth surface. So if you could get that separation, that would be also excellent. All right, likelihood, improving pedestrian crossing facilities, a raised safety platform. We will get into more discussion around that later on, but I think that's a great idea. More trees and street furniture, that's great. I love it when we think broader than just the road safety realm, but we acknowledge that these are streets, for placemaking. So anything that we can do to improve that streetscape, I like that kind of thinking. Perhaps it's a bit outside our field. It might more fit within urban design or things like that, but it's good to still acknowledge that those are treatments that are available. And changing parking lanes instead of traffic lanes. Changing parking lanes instead of, okay, so there's a parking lane on this side. Changing it to a parking lane. Okay, so installing a parking lane, reducing the amount of traffic lanes within that space there. Yeah, I wouldn't refer that to an exposure, because you've probably still got the same amount of vehicles, depending, I guess, how many. I guess if I meant change the entire road to a parking area. Okay, Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, certainly. Yep, that would influence exposure then, because it's unlikely you'd have that same throughput of traffic if it just became one giant parking area. I'm not sure you would have hit the criteria for making it a place for people though, if it was just lots and lots of cars here. But theoretically, I understand where you're coming from there. But I'll show you an illustration of how this could look if we were to redesign this environment. This one in particular is to do with, just looking at it more from a pedestrian and cyclist safety. So you can see a lot of those things there that you touched on, those treatments like wide footpaths, that's been implemented, streetscaping improvements, lower speed. This has also been redesigned as a one-way shared street. Another interesting thing, or kind of a bugbear, I suppose, if this was a shared street, what that actually means is pedestrians have priority. That's what the shared entails. So it's no longer just the carriageway belongs to general traffic. Pedestrians and people crossing, they have the priority at all instances within that shared zone, that shared area. So the need to install, a little bit difficult to see, a zebra crossing there is actually redundant, because pedestrians can cross anywhere priority. They don't need that. This is the spot where you have priority. Anywhere along there would be classified as priority, but that's just a minor bugbear, I suppose. Another way we could have reprioritized this area or redesigned it is to, all right, let's try and really get people on to our buses, and rather than removing that as exposure, let's promote that as a mode choice here. So providing bus lanes, and what we have here is separated cycling facilities. So in the previous design, we just had like a shared area where cyclists would ride on the road, and the speed limit supported that because it was 10 kilometers per hour. In this example, where we actually have bus lanes, very heavy vehicles, we're actually advocating for separated bicycle lanes. It is at a 30 kilometer per hour mark. So 30 is generally accepted as appropriate for cyclists to share the road through the use of sharrows, which we will hop into a little bit later. So it's possible that they could have shared, the traffic lane there. However, if there was carriageway width available, we'd certainly be advocating for separated facilities just to further reduce that risk of any collision. We've got a similar exercise now with another classification within the movement in place framework. And this one is, we're looking at local streets now. So once again, we don't really have a high movement function. It's not incredibly important that traffic flows remain, undisturbed. Similarly, it doesn't hold a lot of place value, and people can get quite upset when you say that their local street doesn't have a lot of place value, but this framework is meant to be interpreted at a statewide level or at a more global level. So if you think of, what would a high place function area be, it's where people congregate in the most mass, which would be your high streets, CBDs, those types of areas. So not really your local streets. So although they might have personal, sentimental place value, as a community as a whole, it's unlikely that our local streets still serve that function. So just a heads up there if you ever get in that conversation with anyone from the community. But similar exercise, what we'll do is I'll show you a little artist rendition of a pretty common, residential street, which would actually most likely be at a 50 kilometer per hour because the urban default would apply. This could be, any residential area that you've visited. Generally, this would look as a layout. You'd have parking on the sides, a two-way lane arrangement. So one lane each way. And if everyone could once again put into the chat any treatment recommendations and with a bracket afterwards to say that would influence exposure, likelihood, or severity. This time I'll give you 5 minutes. So my clock says 11:31 is when we'll be back, because I'll give you a chance just to have a stretch, maybe grab a cup of tea or whatever. And at the end of the break, we'll get stuck into some of those treatment options. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you managed to get a stretch in. I know I did. Yeah, lots of good responses coming through again. I might just pick out a few, just like I did last time. Just have a chat through, but feel free to keep them coming through as I'm having a chat. So now marking a separated bicycle lane is a very interesting one. I've got a slide later on which will perhaps make it a bit clearer as to what I'm going to say, but to me, it reduces the likelihood because you've got separate facilities, like there's a bicycle lane there, separation, and then a traffic lane. But I wouldn't say it influences exposure because unless it's completely off-road and there's never any conflict, which is pretty rare, then you could say it influences exposure. But generally, you'll have crossing over minor streets or crossing over driveways and things like that. So there still is an exposure between general traffic and cycle lanes. So that's why if we're talking separated cycle lanes, we tend to put that in the likelihood category, not exposure. The other one I saw there was wider footpaths, which I would say that would influence likelihood as well. Because, yeah, you're reducing the amount of carriageway width, so reducing the amount of time that pedestrians need to cross over. And apart from that, it's just obviously creating a much more attractive environment for pedestrians. All right, streetscaping, one-way vehicle traffic, that would influence exposure. I agree with that. One-way road, reducing speed and changing the geometry. Lots of reducing speeds, which could be correctly attributed to both likelihood and severity. So it's good to see that coming through. Opt out could close off the busy people zone and use for people only, no through traffic. So create like a mall situation, I'm guessing. Separate peds and cyclists, move traffic to a more movement zone. So that's thinking a bit higher level, strategically. What do we want these networks to look like? Maybe we want to move this into a civic space or the places for people more. So maybe the movement of vehicles isn't important to us. So that's a good suggestion. Compact roundabout with pedestrians crossings on raised safety platforms on each approach. Very interesting suggestion. We've got an example of that coming up later on, so I might leave it there. Add pinch points to slow traffic or any kind of local area traffic management treatments. Yep. And that would influence our likelihood and severity. And raised pedestrian crossings, agreed, that would be likelihood and severity. So here's just a rendition of how the artists saw this future environment. So you can see they have gone with a one-way shared street. They've also gone for a lower speed zone, 20 kilometers per hour. Another interesting thing about this is, so you've got this geometry change, which was also mentioned, but you can kind of see that horizontal deflection. That's likely going to do a pretty good job at slowing down traffic because they have to, slow down to swerve to make that maneuver. Horizontal geometry is not all that common. We tend to go for vertical geometry within local streets through speed humps. Even in the Miller Street example that we looked at the start, that was through vertical geometry. But this idea of, making it a little bit more inconvenient for traffic to get through there is a good way to slow down traffic. Another interesting thing, because this is in a 20 kilometer per hour zone, the idea that cyclists share the road is generally accepted. So if that was, a 40 kilometers, for instance, we'd look at separating those two road users, but because it is lower speeds. That idea of sharing the roadway is deemed acceptable. What else have we got here? Yeah, wider footpaths. We've got things like benches, you know, for streetscaping, more gardening opportunities. The intersection to me still looks a little bit ill-defined. So that suggestion of a compact roundabout would probably fit in well there, or just any roundabout would probably work within there in that space. But yeah, really good suggestions that have come through. And you can see how all the ideas that you've kind of generated more or less do get captured within these artistic renditions. So you've all got the thinking there. The most critical exercise that most critical skill that we're trying to get out of this exercise is the categorization into exposure, likelihood, severity, which we're doing a very good job of as well. So we do have one more of these examples. This last one we might go through a little bit quicker. But it is a very challenging example. So we're still within that space of, I'll show you an artistic rendition and we'll see what treatments we can apply within this. But the strategic background that I'm giving you for this one is, I'm telling you this is very important to keep people moving through here. So we need to get people moved through here. But it's also a place where people want to hang out. So there could be bars and clubs and, you know, a local footy pitch or something like that along here where people want to dwell and spend time. So we've got those two strong objectives that sometimes work in the opposing direction, but we need to try and work out a solution within this space. Not going to lie, very difficult, very, very challenging.
Sorry, Max, just a quick question in the chat.
Yeah.
From Ash, when turning a street into a one-way street, does the cost of the move a whole channel of traffic to a new place outweigh the value of the redesign?
The valid question. It would certainly be dependent on that network that you're looking at, you know, project by project, exactly how that would look. The reason I say that is if you were to do that, you know, in that residential streets that we looked at before, and there was absolutely no context, it was just a random local street that didn't really connect anywhere, or, you know, the community would just be like, why was this done here? Like, what's going on? And it's unlikely that that would achieve, you know, the benefits that you're after. However, if there was a strategic reason, so for instance, if north of that road, there was a shared area, which was like a mall, and south of that road, there was a train station. And that was a one corridor that, although it was a local street, lots and lots of pedestrians and cyclists used it to get into the town CBD or whatever it is. You'd have a much better chance of achieving, you know, much better chance of getting that BCR or that benefit cost ratio above whatever you need it to be within that circumstance, because you can see, well, that actually provides strategic value to reduce speeds there, make it a one-way zone, you know, invest money in there and infrastructure, because our objectives are no longer to support through traffic in both directions. It's more about creating that place for people. And that can also develop over time, you know, as I'm sure everyone's seen in, you know, CBDs and things like that, laneways that used to be signposted at 50, 60 kilometers per hour, speeds have already come down. Parking is already being removed in instances to create either outdoor dining or streetscaping opportunities. So we are really seeing this change happen. And it just depends on every, you know, how that network is being identified strategically. Good question. Okay, so I will run through this last exercise again with everyone. Once again, we're trying to move this or transform this space into something that better aligns with, yes, we want movement of people, but we also want movement. Sorry, we also value this as a place. So in other words, all these shops on the side, they're really cool, trendy places. So we want to make sure that people feel comfortable crossing over the road, getting from A to B, and, you know, enjoying this as an actual place to be, a destination. So I'll just do 2 minutes for this one. Just because I think we've got the ball rolling quite well with the previous examples. All right, I can see some answers coming through now. I might just begin chatting through some of them. Separating bus and bike lanes. So, yeah, you can see at the moment we've kind of just got cyclists traveling on the carriageway. There's no real bicycle infrastructure whatsoever, as well as buses and general traffic. So separating those is a great idea. I would just caveat that would be a likelihood thing as opposed to exposure, because we'll probably still have the same number of buses and the same number of cyclists, if not more, if we were to install that facility. And you could say that, well, but the conflict between those has changed, which is also a pretty fair argument, but it's likely that the conflict has just been pushed somewhere else. So it could just be a little bit further down the road where cyclists need to cross over or buses need to cross over. So it would depend exactly what this road network looked like and how that design looked like, but most likely that would just be to do with likelihood. Getting lots of suggestions about the pedestrian overpass, which I'm glad people are bringing up because I've got some thoughts on it. In principle, it's a great solution because we're achieving that grade separation. So we're achieving that reduction in exposure, or we're influencing exposure. So if we're getting pedestrians up here, crossing over the road and then coming back the other side, they don't have to interact with traffic. Perfect. Unfortunately, the practical world does not work as we often hope or imagine. And even in this illustration, you can see a person deciding to cross over there with their dog and people waiting in the middle of these islands to, you know, cross over the carriageway. And I think that's something that we really need to acknowledge whenever we're doing overpasses, particularly where you've got, you know, strong pedestrian demand, which is like these environments. It's virtually impossible to be able to match the desire lines for everywhere along this strip, because there's a whole, you know, there's a whole raft of opportunities where people may want to be crossing. So even if they have to go, you know, this could be 10 meters or whatever to go to the stairs, if it's 10 meters out of their way, they may not be bothered. They also may not be bothered to walk up the stairs or down the stairs, as that, well, they may be physically unable to do that. They may not want to. You know, there's accessibility issues and concerns that you need to think about as well. So I'm not trying to say that we should never do overpasses. They're wonderful things, but particularly when within these urban environments, we just need to acknowledge that a lot of the pedestrian demand will still be to take their chances and just cross over this carriageway. And some of you may have already made a note about, well, there are these pedestrian fences, and there's also some at the back here, to try and reduce that as a risk. So not to encourage pedestrians crossing over. And once again an issue that I think we're quite ready to apply, but we should probably consider the context, because if pedestrians want to cross at that location, a fence won't necessarily stop them, particularly if it's, a fence at that height. So there's two aspects to that. The first one is, if a pedestrian wants to cross there, a fence isn't going to stop them. The second one is, if you keep putting up these fences, you're really impacting that place function. It doesn't look like a place you want to be. It feels like you're in a little bit of a tunnel, and everything's not open, and you don't feel like you've got connectivity to the other side of the road where you want to go and visit. You've just got these, like designated walkways, and that's it. You're limited. So it's got road safety implications, but it also got that placemaking implications as well. I really went on a tangent with that one today, Kez, but there you go, just some thoughts there. I love this suggestion by Trent. We might give Trent a prize here about a tunnel for cars. Why not? I didn't give you any feasibility or budget constraints. Let's just bury into the ground and all general traffic and head down below, and all of pedestrians and cyclists are free to use this land. It's a great suggestion, thinking outside the box. Elevated footpaths, cut and cover tunnel for cars. I've got another tunnel there from Greg. Widen footpaths, dedicated bus lanes, shared path next to bus lanes, widen the overpass and providing a lift as well. Very good, thinking about that accessibility. Reducing speed, raised platforms, influencing the likelihood and severity, which I agree with. So well done. We'll hop into how this could look. And this one's a really, what I think, quite a clever suggestion, because you can automatically say, all right, well, I haven't got the same amount of traffic lanes there, so I've obviously haven't got the same capacity. But this has been strategically done, because what we have now is prioritized bus transit lanes. And as I touched on earlier, when we're looking at the movement in place framework, for movement, it's the movement of people. It's not the movement of passenger vehicles. So even with reduction in traffic lanes, if you're getting more people on the bus because they're running every 5 minutes, it's quicker, it's safer, it drops them off exactly where they want, you can get obviously a lot more people on a bus than a passenger vehicle. So you may still be achieving that exact same output as in number of people traveling through that area within a much more constrained, confined carriageway. So I think this is a very clever solution that they've opted for here. The other thing that they've noted here is just a separated bicycle path. And this one is called a bi-directional facility, because cyclists can travel in both directions. Commonly, they're just unidirectional, one direction. So cyclists would need to travel into the screen, would have to travel on the other side of the carriageway. Well, this is the other way around, but you know what I mean. So like you'd have two facilities, one in one direction, one in the other direction, following the traffic flow, the adjacent traffic flow. But bi-directional is, we just put all cyclists over here, and you can travel in both directions. Although it does look like that there's another bi-directional over there, which is, pretty cool feature. We've also got this idea of, once again, speed reductions. It's an inevitable conversation to be had when you're looking at road safety. It's just intrinsically linked, so it's all part and parcel. And this 10-kilometre local, that just refers to this local access. So it's a little bit vague, but it means, in the area that isn't classified as that high movement function, in that local area, which is seen off screen, it can reduce the speeds there even further. Any questions there, Kez? Everyone happy with the analysis done there?
Yeah, I think so. I think Chantal just put it last thing. Did anyone say light rail as an option?
Yeah, it's a great suggestion, Chantal. I'm not sure if I saw it in there, but absolutely. While we're in this brainstorming phase, like I didn't want to constrain your ideas too much, and I think light rail is just another example of how we can bulk move people without having to build wider and wider, more and more traffic lanes. So definitely a good suggestion. All right. Speaking of cycling facilities, this here is referred to as a protected bicycle lane. So there's a bit going on here. The most kind of important feature are these corner curb refuges, as they're referred to as. You can see, well, it's at each quadrant of the intersection. They have these little curb outstands, you could call them, little concrete sections, which basically means rather than a vehicle turning left and cutting across as they would in a traditional intersection, it forces them to take a much more sweeping bend. Let's get all my pens lined up. Something like this. Yeah. And the reason that we encourage this type of design is because what that means is if I had a cyclist that's riding from the right of screen to the left of screen through this intersection, they'd be traveling through here and they've got the green light to go. When this vehicle crosses over at this point, the cyclist that they need to give way to is virtually right in front of them. It's within their windscreen or a little bit to the left of them, but it's very easy for them to sight the cyclist. Traditionally, the cyclist is placed, I'll do this in a blue color just so I don't confuse anyone. Traditionally, the cyclist is placed right up against the left turn traffic lane, so here. And if they wanted to travel through, they'd be doing it at this really awkward angle. So if you're the left turning vehicle, you could have someone on your near side, I think that's called, on your left-hand side, a cyclist there, and it's incredibly difficult to see them. So you've got this awkward situation where cyclists don't know if they should carry through, assume that they've been seen, or, slam on the brakes and let the left turn vehicle pass them. The protected intersection deliberately creates this offset, so it creates separation between that left turn lane and the bicycle lane, in the end goal to achieve a left turn vehicle being able to have improved visibility of cyclists crossing in that area. Just got a question there from Greg. How do you control cyclists heading left and PEDs crossing? Okay, very, very good question. We'll give out a prize there to Greg, please. PEDs. Oh, I might stay in the blue one. So let's say a cyclist wanted to turn left at this point here and carry through down here. But there are pedestrians crossing. There is a big vagueness here as to who has priority. So this one isn't necessarily a great example to demonstrate how you could mitigate that, but what we would recommend and what we've seen implemented, installed, is actually just installing a tiny little zebra crossing across the bicycle lane. Generally, zebra crossings are quite well understood. They're pedestrian priority areas. So as the cyclist travels through here, they see a zebra crossing. They think, oh, okay, I need to slow down, give way to pedestrians. So that's one way to get through it. Another thing you could look to do is you could create essentially a wombat crossing here, and you could raise this up, create a little ramp. So cyclists are forced to slow down, similar to what you do on the road network, on the carriageway, but you could install that as well across the bicycle lane just to physically slow down cyclists. Very good question, though. This is just another example of our bi-directional bicycle lanes. So you can see cycling traffic are able to travel in both directions. This is a pretty good example of where you can see cyclists are being forced to slow down. It's being raised at this section. Not entirely sure why. This one looks like it's in Sydney, judging by the bus. But yeah, this just shows that you can actually elevate or create ramps on bicycle paths as well. So it's not just for general traffic, but by providing that vehicle vertical deflection, you'll be able to slow down cyclists. So presumably this would be, an area where there's pedestrians crossing. Maybe this could be a bus stop perhaps, and people are crossing off at that location. But anyway, just an example of that ramp in action. All right. The final category within the movement in place framework is this movement corridor. And then this is where we acknowledge that, all right, it's quite important to get, movement of people, but the place value isn't quite as significant. So there may be local businesses and industry on the left, adjacent to the carriageway, but it's unlikely to be significant volumes of pedestrians and cyclists visiting those places. So what we can do within this space that has been achieved, the thing that you're most kind of worried about within our movement corridors, particularly where they intersect with other movement corridors, is managing the speeds at those intersections. So if you've got, a high priority arterial road connecting another high priority arterial road, the way that these are treated traditionally is signalized intersection, and that's it. Just walk away from it. We've very much come from a place of signalized intersection is the best that we can do, and that's all there is to it. Well, we've moved past that, and we are actually advocating for other interventions, one of which involves raising the intersection. And this is an actual example of this arterial road takes about 10,000 vehicles per day. It's got buses and trucks and a whole raft of users. And it also connects with another major movement corridor. It's a 70 kilometre per hour speed limit on the two roads, but at the intersection, the ramp brings it down to 50 kilometres per hour. And if you remember, the kind of crash threshold for T intersection crash types or intersection crash types is 50 kilometres per hour. So there's no coincidence that that speed was chosen to use for the ramp grade. So we're liberally ensuring that if an accident does occur here, then the crash will hopefully not result in a fatal injury. Wonderful, wonderful interventions, because even if a person were distracted, didn't see the oncoming ramp or all the signs, or they were doing a red light run, for instance, and just not paying attention, whatever the reason, the ramp grade is likely to wipe off a lot of that speed. So say they were traveling at 70 and you had no idea it was there. It probably won't take you all the way down to 50, but you're likely to get down to 55 or something like that, just from that vertical deflection. So that means if you were to crash with someone at that intersection, it would have a much improved crash outcome as opposed to if that was you going through at 70. And the reason I say that is because every kilometre that you reduce within like your crash speed, every kilometre per hour that is a reduction has immense crash reduction risk, crash outcome severity risk. So it's, I think as Ken's already talked on this, but it's not a linear relationship. It's not like you go down a little bit in speed, you go down a little bit in the crash severity. It's much more like curvilinear. So it's any like tiny little bits in speed reduction actually make a big difference in the severity. So even if you're reducing speeds by 5 kilometers within that intersection, you would see results within the, the level of trauma that's occurring there. So it's just wonderful things to say about these raised intersections. Okay, back to cyclists and pedestrians. So generally considered the most vulnerable of our road users, particularly young, and even the old are considered more vulnerable, obviously due to their developing or more frail bodies. The young in particular, as they don't have the same cognitive ability to be able to understand the carriageway and, understand not running out on the road and things like that. But also the fact that they're so much smaller and lower to the ground makes it more difficult to see. They can be covered by, roadside furniture a lot easier. The chance of a severe injury, there's a 10% chance of severe injury where the speed of collision is just 20 kilometers per hour. So we're so far from achieving that, because we're currently advocating for, if there's going to be a collision with a pedestrian or a cyclist, we should aim for that 30 kilometer per hour mark, because that's relating to fatal injuries. But if we take into consideration severe injuries, so that's hospitalization, we should be, mindful of 20 kilometers or below is actually the impact speed that we're after. But the reason that we haven't set that target yet within the safe system thinking is because we're just so far away from achieving 30 that, to try and tackle the 20 would just be probably overzealous. So that's the reason, which is, it's not a perfect world that we live in, but that's just, acknowledging that there are other factors that come into play. So the 30 kilometer fatal injury is the one that's been used to guide a lot of the safe system thinking. This was what I was talking about before with the cyclists having separated treatments, and I will go back to the comment that was received somewhere at the start as to whether this relates to exposure, likelihood, or severity. So the reason I put this in the likelihood camp, so imagine if there wasn't a separated facility for cyclists and they're just riding adjacent the parking, adjacent the traffic lane within the dooring zone. You've certainly reduced the risk of a collision by providing this separated treatment, because you've got a whole parking lane and as well as these massive physical buffers. So you've done a really good job at reducing the risk of a vehicle colliding with a cyclist. The reason I wouldn't put it into the exposure category is because the number of cyclists remain the same, or they might go up. The vehicles that are driving through there remains the same, likely to remain the same. And the conflict points actually are still there. So there could be driveways, for instance, or minor roads or whatever, and things like that, which means they're still crossing over the cycle lane. So there still exists the conflict point. So that's why we tend not to put these separated treatments into the exposure category. It only is likelihood. You could argue that you could put this into the severity category as well, because, well, if a vehicle was turning in and crossing over, that's going to be at a much lower speed than just driving, in a sideswipe type of crash. Also, if a motorist was to run off road and collide with this before heading into the bicycle lane, that's going to wipe off some speed, so you can reduce severity there as well. But generally, we just say those protected bicycle lanes reduce likelihood. This was the slide I mentioned before about a protected roundabout. So for those that haven't seen this before, it's basically creates a periphery ring around a roundabout, around a roundabout. That was fun to say. Where cyclists have priority the whole way around. So traditionally, cyclists are forced into the circulating area or at a periphery of the actual circulating area. The periphery one is a really poor design, and it's not one that's recommended anymore. So you may see them out there on the network, but they're certainly not recommended. The reason being, if you're a cyclist on the periphery and a vehicle kind of wants to exit at this point, it's very confusing who gives way, and cyclists are in that blind spot. So it's a very poor outcome. But this type of arrangement, what we actually have is basically it's an off-road facility for cyclists the whole way around, and they have priority, which means the vehicles exiting the roundabout and vehicles entering the roundabout have to give way to pedestrians and cyclists crossing. So this is a real example. This is just the graphic marker, but this is in Moray Street in South Melbourne. I know if there's anyone online from TMR, but Queensland have a few of these as well up in Caloundra, in a new development up there, which is very exciting to see. So I fully expect more of these to be installed because they just offer a greater level of protection for cyclists, particularly for cyclists that don't feel comfortable riding on the road because, you know, for whatever reason, maybe they like being just away from general traffic altogether. They don't want to be anywhere near roads. And generally past practice has been like, well, there's nothing we can do at these roundabouts. You have to merge at this point. But this provides a solution where cyclists have priority and yeah, just wonderful, wonderful intervention. Other thing I've got to mention is it's also raised. So once again, just providing that connection. Albert sign says to, give way to pedestrians and cyclists. Very well spotted. It does just say to pedestrians. You could probably argue that that little walking man sign says to pedestrians. The panel that I've actually seen is a supplementary panel where it's like a person walking. Oh, it's going to be fantastic. And then a little bike symbol next to it as well. So anything symbolic, I think, is a better way to do it. But yeah, give way, and then this supplementary panel, which looks like that, which is in a road design note. If you would like access to that, just flick me an email and I'll send it over. Another cool example that I like to show is this idea of how that movement in place thinking can actually impact the way that we select our treatments. So in this example, I'm just going to say east-west along here is, or left-right, is a high movement corridor. So you can see there's multiple lanes. It looks like it's an important road, right? A freeway or something like that. Whereas I'm going to assume our north and south legs are not. They have a local importance. Maybe it's to connect into a residential community or something like that, but they don't have that same strategic importance. And the reason I bring this up is because that can then influence what treatments you apply when crossing that road. So if we look at the north side first, we can see for pedestrians and cyclists to cross over here, they actually have a raised facility. So similar to that Moray Street protected roundabout, they're raised up, they can cycle straight across and general traffic have to yield to them. Cyclists then can continue their journey, and if they wanted to cross over the road on that east-west link, we acknowledge, no, hang on, this is a motorway. This is an important area for the movement of traffic, so you need to yield to general traffic. So this is like a real example of where, depending on where things fit within that M&P classification, it can impact on what treatment that you put there. Just fun little fact, I guess. But I will also add in the caveat there that if you were to be crossing over a motorway or something like that, grade separation would be much better. It would be a better way to approach that. The Dutch would look at that design and be like, that's wacky. You need to grade separate them. Anyway, cycling treatments, where we're in the 0 to 30 kilometre per hour range, we generally accept that lane sharing is okay, and that can be supplemented through the use of sharrows, which is just shared arrows. Basically, it communicates to cyclists that you can claim the traffic lane. You're allowed to ride in the middle of the traffic lane because you're just like any other user here. Where you get in between 30 and 70, we really want to start separating the two users. So we want to see separation, similar to those Copenhagen or protected bicycle lanes. The final category between 70 and 100 is where you really want to provide off-road bicycle paths. So you want to have a significant buffer in between general traffic and your bicycle lanes, which admittedly we don't achieve very well within our networks, but that is our aspiration. Okay, pedestrians. So first thing we'll get stuck into is the wombat crossings, which we know influence both the likelihood and severity. They influence severity because they physically slow down motorists. So if you're slowing down, you've got a speed reduction, that's going to be impacting severity, but also they reduce the likelihood just by raising up pedestrians, and any speed reduction as well will also impact the likelihood. So we generally have the philosophy of, if you've got any zebra crossings or you're proposing any zebra crossings, you should be trying to do what you can to raise them up and creating a wombat facility just to provide that extra safety performance for vulnerable road users. This is a site in South Australia. It's the University of Adelaide. There's actually a construction site, and in South Australia, when they have construction on, they reduce the speed limit to 25 kilometres per hour. So just to give you a bit of context, there's a few sparkies or electricians working behind those barriers there, fixing the pedestals or doing something. And before they get out on site, you know, it's acknowledged that while they're working next to a live traffic environment, it's very risky. So we're going to slow the speed, and we're also going to install these physical barriers just to make sure you're looked after. But the interesting thing is, as soon as the work's done, the barriers disappear and the traffic limit is reinstated to 60 kilometers per hour. I could be wrong, could be 50, but much higher speed. And then it's kind of makes you ponder. So when we're at work and we acknowledge that our workplace should be free from risk, or at least mitigating risks, and everyone's generally accepting, yeah, we've got to slow down traffic, we've got to install these barriers, of course we do, because we've got to look after the workers. However, in all other conditions, when it's just general pedestrians trying to cross over this road, it's generally like, good luck. And we don't have those same measures in place. And people may argue, well, those workers, they're focused on their task and, you know, they're not paying attention to the local road environment and stuff, which is valid, but you could also argue that for every pedestrian that crosses over. It's unlikely that they're paying full attention to the road around them. They could be on their phone or listening to music, talking to someone, you know, and even if there was an errant vehicle, there's nothing to physically separate them. So it's not as if they're going to be able to just dive out of the way or protect themselves in some way. So it's just an interesting example of where we acknowledge things within the workplace. Yep, that's definitely risky. And we also acknowledge that within our road safety realm as, you know, managers of the road network, but we don't necessarily implement the same measures. Might just skip over that one. Raising the intersection, as we've touched on in many of the treatments, will influence likelihood and severity. So anywhere you've got speed reduction treatments, likelihood and severity. Same with raising a threshold. This slide here, it shows on the y-axis the number of casualty crashes per year, and along the x is just the years over up until 2010. Casualty, just to clarify, is fatal and serious injury. And you can see it's more or less steady, slowly increasing until this point here where there's a sharp decline, which is referred to as a step change. And that was around about in the year 2002, or it probably occurred 2001, in between that period. That happens to coincide with the year that Australia, this is Australian data, I should have clarified, that Australia changed its urban default speed limit from 60 kilometres per hour to 50 kilometres per hour. That one policy saw this step change in the amount of trauma that is occurring on the road network. So there's two important takeaways from that is speed is absolutely critical in managing our risks on the road network. Further, if we are genuinely interested in achieving these step change, it kind of needs to come at these broader policy level decisions where we say, this is what we are doing, because they can be instantaneous and they can genuinely see significant reductions in trauma. So while project level is fantastic, much bigger picture is advocating for, lower speed zones and things like that. All right, the final topic of today is motorcyclists and the way that we characterize our motorcycle safety issues or concerns are to do with these 5 S's, which are sight, surface, signs, strike, and speed, which is a bit of a tongue twister. The first 3, sight, surface, and signs, all impact our likelihood. The strike is our severity, and the speed, as we've been saying throughout today's module, relates to both likelihood and severity. I'll go through all these points one by one, just so you've got a bit of clarity of what I'm talking about here. But I first wanted to just acknowledge that there is some new literature that's being developed, which is suggesting that motorcyclists are actually more resilient than what we expect. So there's been lots and lots of studies of all the motorcycle crashes that have occurred and what speeds those have occurred. As I mentioned, within the Safe System Assessment Framework, we lump motorcyclists in with pedestrians and cyclists. So we aim for that 30 kilometre per hour conflict speed. However, there is research out there to suggest that maybe that could be a bit higher because motorcyclists do have the leather protection, the helmet, and things like that. But for the purposes of conducting SSAs and what is current practice is to still use motorcyclists as that 30 kilometre per hour crash threshold. But just wanted to acknowledge that that work is coinciding with. Okay, the first thing that's very important with crash risk and motorcyclists is to do with sight. So ensuring that there's adequate sight lines. So in this snapshot, we don't see any motorcyclist, and then half a second later, there was actually a motorcyclist hidden behind that tree. So just acknowledging that things that you may not necessarily consider an obstruction to general traffic can definitely impact on sight lines for motorcyclists. And in this particular instance, like you may have assumed I'm right to enter the intersection, there's no one oncoming, but just having that extra half a second to do another check to see that, oh, hang on, it's a motorcycle sitting behind them. So sight lines, incredibly important. And I should have also mentioned the sight lines is to do with the likelihood of a crash occurring. Surface is also got to do with our likelihood. Motorcyclists are often referred to as the canary in the coal mine when it comes to road surface defects, because if there's anything in the pavement that is untoward or not smooth, they feel it much more than in a passenger vehicle. For 2 reasons, they're on a smaller amount of tread, and also because they're leaning their body over like this, when they are subject to potholes or something like that, it is much more intense than just being in a passenger vehicle. So those kind of things are really, really important for motorcycling communities. And if you've ever done things like motorcycle audits, having smooth surfaces is incredibly important, particularly issues that we come across are areas where you might be intersecting with a gravel road or a gravel driveway, and lots of the gravel is just flushed onto the pavement, which creates that surface issue. And so the treatment there would just be sealing those areas. Another surface issue, more in, I suppose, metro environments, but things like, if you've got an open excavation within the carriageway. So you have to use things like pit lids. Well, what is the actual friction value on those surfaces, particularly where motorcyclists are turning, because that could create a skidding issue, or, you know, loss of control or things like that. Other thing you'd be worried about is, you know, the ramp up onto that particular lid, because you want to make sure that's a smooth transition. So there's a few things to consider if you're working in that space. Motorcyclist signage. So that's everything to do with like chevron alignment markers and curve warning signs and things like that, all impact the likelihood of a crash occurring. Signs like this as well, just indicating that it's a, you know, it's a winding route. The strike, what that refers to is, okay, all of those other measures have been in place, but at this point in time, a cyclist has come off their bike. What are they hitting, and how frangible is that item, and how, you know, friendly is it to hit that item? I think this is a video. Just check this out. Oh yes, this is just a crash test dummy colliding into a guardrail post, and then we have another video of it colliding into a underrun protection, which you can see does a much better job of protecting that dummy. Either situation is not ideal. I wouldn't want to be either of those dummies, that's for sure. But we acknowledge that putting this extra run of barrier underneath the system does, to a degree, reduce the severity. Now, it's no more or less likely, but you've reduced the severity. And the final one is speed. So just like with all our other treatments we've mentioned, when we're talking about speed, that has the power to influence our likelihood and severity. Speed is incredibly common to display, you know, on popular motorcycle routes. And these signs are so important for the motorcycle community as general traffic. You know, we kind of acknowledge them, and we may reduce our speed to somewhat agree with those signs. However, for motorcyclists, it really helps them gauge and plan their route to ensure that they are, you know, hitting corners at appropriate speeds. So something to be mindful of. We actually have a little quiz at the end of today's, or a poll, Kez, if you wanted to share that with the group. We've got a few minutes left, so we can share that. All right, so it's just jumped up on my screen. Hopefully everyone can see it. True or false? If using a proper helmet and good safety gear, a motorcyclist can be considered as a passenger vehicle / car in a safe system crash force tolerances. True, false, unintelligible. Although that actually says flays, so we might need to update that whole question. Let's give it 10 seconds and then we can end the poll. Right, looks like everyone has nearly participated, but I might just close the poll there and share the results with everyone. And I tend to agree that is flays, because even if motorcyclists have all that protection on, they don't have airbags or the crumple zone that you have with a car, or, you know, the actual structure of a vehicle. So if you were to roll over, you're just encased in this metal structure. So cars are generally much better off. Motorcyclists are much more vulnerable. So, but I understand why unintelligible question was there as well. That's the end of today's module. So hopefully we've managed to cover the vulnerable road user risk and all that categorization into exposure, likelihood, and severity. That's becoming a bit more comfortable with that experience. But I do encourage you, if you didn't understand anything or you want any clarification, just drop me a line or drop Kes a line, and we're happy to help you out. But there is a module after today's, so there is a quiz after today's module. So we'll encourage you to get onto that as soon as possible. And anything else, Kes?
No, not that I can see. No outstanding questions.
Excellent. Oh, well, thank you very much for your time. Hope you have a fantastic day and enjoy the rest of the course.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Max.